I was 22 years old, 3 weeks away from starting my first semester at an Ivy League graduate program, and working 40 hours a week as a laboratory research assistant while finishing my final summer project. My grandfather, Arthur, who was 78 and still insisted on polishing his shoes every Sunday morning, had spent 11 months quietly preparing for that moment with me. He bought a navy leather document folder the day my acceptance letter arrived and carefully stored every scholarship letter, housing confirmation, and tuition receipt inside it. At exactly 8:17 p.m. on August 11th, while he was tying a blue ribbon around that folder so he could hand it to me before I left, my phone rang once, and everything he had worked so patiently to celebrate disappeared. 3 years later, that same navy folder rested alone on a weathered wooden bench outside the university library, waiting for someone who never expected to see it again. Here's what my sister never understood about that phone call and about the years leading up to it. The lie she told lasted only a few weeks. The choices everyone else made because of that lie lasted much longer. By the time the truth finally reached our family, none of us were arguing about cancer anymore. We were arguing about what had always mattered most inside our house and who had been expected to surrender first. Growing up, my family never admitted we had a ranking system, but we all understood it without anyone saying it aloud. Crisis always outranked achievement. Tears outweighed effort. Whoever looked the most fragile automatically became the most important person in the room. My older sister, Melissa, had learned that lesson before either of us finished elementary school. Whenever Melissa struggled with a class, my parents canceled weekend plans to comfort her. When I brought home perfect report cards, they smiled, put them on the refrigerator for a day or two, and then moved on. I told myself that was normal because I didn't want to sound ungrateful. Looking back, I realized I wasn't simply being overlooked. I was helping protect a system that rewarded emergencies more than consistency. The only person who seemed to notice was Grandpa Arthur. He never made dramatic speeches. Instead, he quietly collected evidence that hard work mattered. Every certificate I earned disappeared into that navy folder. Every science fair ribbon, debate medal, recommendation letter, and scholarship notice found its place inside carefully labeled plastic sleeves. He even wrote the dates on small white index cards in neat handwriting, saying, "Years blur together." Details remind us what we actually survived. By the time I graduated from college with a 3.96 GPA, the folder had grown too thick to close properly. When my acceptance email from an Ivy League university arrived at exactly 6:42 a.m. one April morning, Grandpa drove 43 miles just to bring me breakfast before work. He placed a cinnamon roll beside my laptop, adjusted his glasses twice, and whispered, "I always knew your future would ask more of you than this town ever could." For once, even my parents looked genuinely proud. We spent the next several months planning everything with almost obsessive care. I confirmed my enrollment through the university portal, forwarded every receipt to my parents, and printed copies for Grandpa because he preferred paper over screens. My housing contract was signed on June 18th. My orientation schedule arrived on July 7th. At a family dinner on July 24th, my mother even raised a glass and said, "To Emily, who leaves in 24 days." Everyone nodded. Melissa smiled too. Then she leaned back in her chair, twirled the ice in her lemonade, and said with a little laugh, "Well, sick beats smart in this house." The room went quiet for half a second before my father chuckled and called her dramatic. I laughed with everyone else. If I had understood what that sentence really meant, I would have stopped laughing right there. The answer came 18 days later. On August 11th, at exactly 8:17 p.m., my phone lit up while Grandpa Arthur was fastening the blue ribbon around the navy folder on our dining room table. "Mom calling." I smiled before answering. I assumed she wanted to remind me to pack my winter coat or ask whether I'd printed another housing document. Instead, I heard sobbing. Not quiet crying. Deliberate, breathless sobbing that made every sentence arrive in pieces. "Emily. Melissa. The doctors think it's cancer." For several seconds, I didn't understand the words. They felt disconnected from reality, like someone had switched conversations halfway through the call. "What happened?" I asked. They found something during a scan. We don't know everything yet. Your father is taking her to the hospital tomorrow morning. I looked across the room. Grandpa was still standing beside the table, carefully smoothing the ribbon with both hands, unaware that my future had just started slipping away. Within 20 minutes, our family group chat exploded. My aunt wrote, "Family comes before everything." My uncle added, "Emily, your school will still be there next year." A cousin I'd barely spoken to in 6 months texted, "You're the responsible one. Melissa needs everyone." Nobody asked what the doctors had actually confirmed. Nobody mentioned test results. Nobody questioned why the diagnosis seemed complete before additional appointments had even happened. By 9:04 p.m., my mother had already suggested postponing my enrollment. "We'll need your tuition savings available," she said, "just until we know what we're dealing with." I stared at the printed orientation schedule lying beside the Navy folder. Move-in day, August 26th. Student ID pickup, 9:30 a.m. Welcome reception, 6 p.m. Every line suddenly looked like instructions written for someone else's life. Melissa finally called me herself at 9:41 p.m. Her voice sounded strangely calm. "I guess this changes things." "What exactly did the doctors say?" "They're worried." "Worried isn't a diagnosis." She sighed impatiently. "You always need details." "I just want to understand." Then she laughed softly. The same laugh she'd used at dinner. "Sick beats smart in this house." She ended the call before I could answer. I remained in the dining room long after everyone else had gone to bed. Grandpa quietly untied the blue ribbon he'd spent nearly 15 minutes arranging. He didn't complain. He didn't ask why. He simply opened the folder again and slid the housing papers back into their plastic sleeves as though protecting them from rain. That silence hurt more than any argument could have. The next week became a blur of canceled plans. I emailed the university requesting a 1-year deferral. The admissions office replied the following afternoon with kindness I didn't feel I deserved. They approved it. Everyone at home called it the right decision. Everyone except Grandpa. He never criticized my choice. He only carried the unopened folder into his study instead of leaving it by the front door where we'd planned to place it on departure morning. Watching him do that unlocked memories I'd spent years refusing to examine. Melissa crying before my 8th grade spelling championship because she'd finished second in a swim meet. My birthday dinner shortened because she'd had a headache. My college scholarship celebration interrupted when she'd announced another personal crisis. Each time, I'd told myself families naturally prioritized whoever was hurting the most. Now I saw something different. The emergencies always belonged to Melissa. The sacrifices almost always belonged to me. The realization was uncomfortable because it didn't make me only a victim. It made me a participant. Every time I smiled, stayed quiet, or said, "It's okay, I can wait," I had helped convince everyone, including myself, that my dreams could always be postponed. And for the first time in my life, I wondered whether the illness we were all organizing our lives around was the only story no one had bothered to verify. The next morning, I started asking the questions I should have asked the night before. Not because I doubted Melissa was scared, but because every conversation seemed strangely short on facts and overflowing with certainty. At 10:15 a.m., I called my mother. "Which hospital admitted her?" There was a pause. "They're still arranging specialists." "So she isn't admitted?" "They're evaluating everything." I wrote those exact words in a notebook beside my laptop. At 11:40 a.m., I called my aunt, thinking she might know more. She sighed before I even finished my question. "Emily, don't make this a thing. I'm only asking what the doctors actually said. You've always been so logical. This isn't the time." By lunchtime, I realized nobody could answer the same simple question. What diagnosis had actually been made? That afternoon, I met my father outside the pharmacy. He looked exhausted. I expected him to have paperwork or prescriptions in his hands. Instead, he carried only a bottle of water and a receipt for parking. "Dad," I asked quietly, "what's happening?" He rubbed his forehead. "I don't know anymore." "What do you mean?" "Your mother is handling everything." It wasn't an answer. It was an admission that he had stopped asking questions too. That evening I drove to campus to return a borrowed research microscope. My faculty advisor, Professor Naomi Bennett, noticed I was distracted before I said a word. She closed her office door and waited. I explained everything from the phone call to the deferred enrollment. When I finished, she remained silent for several seconds. Then she asked one question no one else had asked. Emily, what evidence have you actually been given? I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Because there wasn't any. Professor Bennett folded her hands. You know what concerns me? What? You made a life-changing decision based entirely on urgency, not information. I stared at the floor. I thought that's what good daughters do. They support family, she replied gently. They don't surrender their future without knowing why. Something inside me shifted. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like a lock turning. That evening I sent Melissa one final offer. I wrote that I would stay another 2 weeks before leaving for school if she needed help with appointments. I offered to fly home every month. I even volunteered part of my research stipend to cover travel expenses. I wasn't asking anyone to choose between us. I was asking whether both futures could still exist. Her reply arrived exactly 7:26 p.m. 3 sentences. If you leave, everyone will know what kind of sister you are. Mom and Dad won't forgive you. Stop pretending this isn't about you. I read the message 5 times. There wasn't a single mention of treatment. Not one doctor's appointment. Not one test. Only control. 5 minutes later another text appeared. Sick beats smart in this house. For the second time, I didn't answer. Instead, I opened my messaging app and typed everything I wanted to say. The first draft was brutal. You stole a year of my life because you couldn't stand not being the center of attention. I deleted it. The second draft was colder. When the truth comes out, don't expect me to protect you. I deleted that too. Then I set my phone face down beside the navy folder Grandpa had quietly returned to me that afternoon. For nearly 10 minutes, I watched the reflection of the kitchen light on its worn leather cover. I finally understood that I had spent 22 years trying to earn fairness from a system designed to reward surrender. I wasn't going to win by arguing inside it. I had to step outside it. So I picked up my phone one last time and sent the only message that required no defense. I've deferred my enrollment because I believed our family was facing a medical emergency. If that emergency is real, I'll continue helping however I reasonably can. If it isn't, my life will no longer be available as proof of my love. Melissa replied only once. Do whatever you want. It was the shortest message she had ever sent me. It was also the moment I realized she had finally lost something she had always counted on. Not my future. My automatic surrender 3 weeks passed before the truth surfaced, and it arrived without drama. Melissa's insurance paperwork was accidentally emailed to my father instead of my mother. There was no oncology referral. No biopsy confirming cancer. No treatment plan. The only documented diagnosis was a benign thyroid nodule that required routine monitoring and another scan in 6 months. The silence inside our house that evening felt heavier than any shouting ever could have. No one looked at me. No one looked at Grandpa. For years, the family had expected us to absorb disappointment without asking questions. Now they had to sit with their own. I didn't rush home after learning the truth. Instead, I asked everyone to come to Grandpa's house the following Saturday at 2 p.m. If Melissa wanted to come, she could. If she didn't, the afternoon would continue anyway. She arrived 43 minutes late. I saw her car through the living room window but finished making tea before opening the front door. For the first time in our lives, she waited for me instead of the other way around. She tried her familiar approach first. I was scared. I nodded. I believe that. Then she tried guilt. I never thought it would go this far. I nodded again. I believe that too. Neither sentence changed what had happened. Finally, her shoulders dropped. She looked smaller than I remembered. What if nobody ever trusts me again? She asked. It was the first honest question she had asked since this began. I answered carefully. My condition isn't about me. She frowned. It's about Grandpa. She looked toward his study, where the navy folder rested on the desk exactly where he'd kept it for 3 years. If you want a place in this family, I continued, you start by telling him the entire truth. No excuses. No audience. No performance. Just the two of you. She didn't argue. She simply nodded. What they said behind that closed study door belongs to them. I only know the conversation lasted almost an hour. When Grandpa finally opened the door, his eyes were red. Melissa's makeup had washed away with tears, and neither of them explained a single sentence. They didn't need to. Some moments become smaller when they're repeated. That one deserved to remain private. A year later, my life looked different than the one I'd imagined at 22, but not smaller. The university honored my deferred admission, and I finally walked across the same stone courtyard carrying the same navy folder Grandpa had bought years earlier. The leather was worn now, its corners softened by time, but every scholarship letter and acceptance document was still inside. Our family changed too. Not perfectly. Just honestly. The old ritual had been birthdays centered around whoever demanded the most attention. The new one happened every first Sunday of September. We met at Grandpa's house, shared lunch, and each person brought one accomplishment and one struggle to the table. Both received the same amount of time. No emergencies automatically outranked quiet effort anymore. Melissa came every year. She never sat at the head of the table again. She never expected to. One afternoon, before anyone else arrived, I noticed her straighten the navy folder after it slid near the edge of Grandpa's bookshelf. She didn't open it. She simply placed it carefully back where it belonged. It was a tiny gesture, but real change usually is. Grandpa eventually handed that folder to me after I completed my graduate degree. Inside, tucked behind my diploma, was the same blue ribbon he had tried to tie around it at 8:17 p.m. on August 11th. I still keep it there. Not because it reminds me of what my sister took. Because it reminds me of what she couldn't. A lie delayed my future by 1 year. A navy folder carried my dream for 3. One quiet conversation rebuilt a family more honestly than decades of pretending ever had. The people who truly love you never ask you to prove it by abandoning yourself.